There is a couple sitting across from a financial advisor, and they are angry, not at each other, at him. They've just been told they're already millionaires, and they don't believe it. They earn a combined income that most people would call modest. No stock windfalls, no inheritance, no lottery ticket. And yet the numbers on the page in front of them say net worth north of $1 million, and they are staring at that page the way you'd stare at a magic trick you can't figure out, waiting for someone to point at the hidden wire. There is no hidden wire. There's just a system. And by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly what that system is, why it works even on people who are bad with money, why it worked on this particular couple without them ever fully noticing it was happening, and why the version of financial discipline you've probably been sold your whole life might be the very thing keeping you broke. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. This story is built on budgeting doesn't work. Not for most people, not long-term. Willpower doesn't work either. You already know this if you've ever tried to diet by staring at a menu and using sheer moral fortitude to avoid the breadbasket. It works for exactly as long as your willpower holds, which is to say, it works until it doesn't. And then you're back where you started, except now you also feel like a failure, which somehow makes the next attempt even harder than the first one. So if discipline is unreliable, and most people's discipline is, in fact, unreliable, then the entire foundation of just budget better collapses. And that's where this story really begins. Not with a spreadsheet, not with a stack of receipts sorted into categories at the kitchen table on a Sunday night, with a decision to stop relying on yourself to remember to be good. The advisor telling this couple's story has his own version of it, tucked quietly into his past, and it's worth knowing because it explains why he believes any of this so completely. He grew up watching his grandmother run a household finance system that looked, on the surface, almost primitive. No spreadsheets, no financial software, nothing that resembled the modern picture of a sophisticated investor. What she had instead was a habit, repeated without fail, of setting money aside the moment it arrived, before it had the chance to become grocery money or bill money or anything else. She didn't call it automation because the word wouldn't have meant anything to her in that context. She just called it paying myself, and she did it the way some people say a prayer before dinner. Not because she debated whether to do it that particular week, but because the question of whether to do it had stopped being a question decades earlier. It simply happened, every time, without negotiation. He didn't understand the significance of it as a child. It just seemed like something grown-ups did. Unremarkable background noise to a normal household. It wasn't until much later, sitting across from clients who were brilliant in their careers and utterly paralyzed around money, that he recognized what he'd actually witnessed. Not brilliance, not deprivation. A structure. A small, repeated, boring structure that ran quietly for decades and produced, at the end of it, something that looked from a distance like extraordinary financial success, even though nothing about the process itself had ever felt extraordinary while it was happening. That's the thread he's been pulling on ever since, in every meeting, with every client, including the couple sitting across from him right now, still not quite believing the number on the page. Let's sit in that advisor's office a little longer, because the story he tells this couple is the frame for everything that follows, and it starts smaller than you'd expect. He asks the husband a simple question: how much do you think you need to save to retire comfortably? The husband throws out a big number, something that sounds impossible on their income, and you can see the deflation happen in real time, right there in his shoulders. That's the moment most people quietly give up on saving altogether. The number feels so large, so distant, so abstract, that saving $5 here or $50 there feels pointless, like bailing out a sinking ship with a teaspoon while the water keeps rising. Then the advisor does something curious. He doesn't argue with the number. He asks about coffee. Specifically, he asks the husband how much he spends each morning on his ritual: the fancy coffee, the pastry, the little treat that makes the commute bearable, the thing that isn't really about caffeine at all, but about having one small, pleasant moment before a long day starts. The husband shrugs. Maybe $5, $6 with tip. No big deal, right? It's just coffee. The advisor does the math out loud. And this is the part of the story that made this book a phenomenon. The part people still repeat at dinner parties decades later. Sometimes without even knowing where it came from. $5 a day, that's $35 a week. That's roughly $150 a month. Doesn't sound like much, but now stretch it, a year. That's over $1,800. Invest that every year at a reasonable average market return over the course of a working lifetime, say from your 20s to your 60s, and you're not looking at $1,800 anymore. You're looking at hundreds of thousands, for some people over $1 million. That daily coffee habit multiplied by decades and compound interest is $1 millionaire's worth of money, quietly leaking out of someone's pocket one paper cup at a time. The wife in the story laughs at first because it sounds absurd. A cup of coffee ruining someone's retirement? But then something shifts in her face because she's doing her own math now, thinking about her own small daily rituals, and she realizes she's been doing this too. Not with coffee, with something else entirely. Everyone has a version of this. That's the trap and the hope, both at once sitting inside the same small habit. This is what gets called, in the language that spread from this book into 1,000 personal finance conversations since, the Latte Factor. Not a lecture about coffee, a lesson about attention. The idea that the biggest threat to your wealth isn't one giant bad decision, it's 100 tiny invisible ones repeated so often they stop looking like decisions at all until they've become part of the architecture of your day, as unquestioned as brushing your teeth. But here's where most people take the wrong lesson from this story, and it's worth pausing on because it matters more than the coffee itself ever could. The lesson isn't stop buying coffee. If you love your morning coffee, you are allowed to keep your morning coffee. The lesson is that everyone has a latte factor, some daily or weekly expense that has become so automatic, so unexamined, that you've stopped noticing it's even a choice. Find yours. It might not be coffee. It might be an app subscription you forgot you had, quietly charging your card every month for a service you use twice. It might be lunches out, 5 days a week, $12 at a time, that somehow never feel like they add up to anything, because each individual transaction is small enough to be forgettable. It might be a dozen little charges scattered across a credit card statement that individually mean nothing and collectively mean everything. And once you find it, you don't need willpower to fix it. You need automation, which is the actual heart of everything that follows. And it's worth building slowly, piece by piece, because the mechanics matter as much as the philosophy. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. Why do bills always get paid, even by people who are otherwise terrible with money? Think about it. The electric company doesn't send you a friendly reminder and hope for the best. They set up automatic payments or they threaten to shut off your power, and either way, the money moves without you agonizing over whether today is a good day to pay the electric bill. It just happens, whether you're paying attention or not, whether you're having a great month or a terrible one. Meanwhile, saving for retirement is treated as optional. It's the thing you do if there's anything left over at the end of the month, and if you've ever tried living paycheck to paycheck, you already know the punchline. There is never anything left over. Something always comes up. The car needs a repair. A birthday sneaks up on you. A friend's wedding requires a flight and a gift, and a hotel room you hadn't budgeted for. Life is expensive, and life is clever about finding new ways to be expensive right when you thought you had breathing room. So the entire premise flips. What if you paid yourself the same way the electric company gets paid, automatically? First, before you see the money, before you have the chance to talk yourself out of it, or negotiate with yourself, or promise yourself you'll make up for it next month. This is the principle sometimes called pay yourself first. And it did not originate in this book. It's ancient advice, showing up in different forms for a century or more, echoed in old parables about setting aside a portion of every coin that passes through your hands. But this story does something clever with the old idea. It removes the moral component entirely. It's not about being a virtuous saver who resists temptation through sheer force of character. It's about making saving invisible, so that resisting temptation is never required in the first place, because the money is already gone before temptation even shows up to make its case. Picture your paycheck arriving. In the old model, the version most people live without ever choosing it consciously, that paycheck lands in your checking account, and from there it gets spent. Rent, groceries, bills, the coffee, the impulse, buy the subscription, all of it, and only afterward if you're lucky. Do you glance at what's left and think about saving, which is usually nothing, because spending expands to fill whatever's available. This is not a character flaw. This is just how money behaves when it sits in an account labeled, even silently, even in your own head, as spendable. Now picture the automatic model instead. Before that paycheck ever reaches your checking account, a slice of it is siphoned off, automatically, silently, without requiring a single moment of willpower, and routed straight into a retirement account, a 401k, if your employer offers one, an IRA if not. The money that arrives in your checking account has already had its savings portion removed. You never see it. You never miss it. Not really, not the way you'd miss it if you had to consciously write a check for it every month and watch the balance drop in front of you. There's a phrase for this idea, and it's blunt on purpose. Pay yourself first, and pay yourself automatically, or you'll pay everyone else first and yourself never. Now, before we go further, there's a piece of this that gets skimmed over too quickly in a lot of retellings, and it deserves its own moment, because it might be the single most literal example of free money that exists anywhere in personal finance: employer matching. If your workplace offers a 401k and matches a percentage of what you contribute, a common structure is something like 50 cents on the dollar up to a certain percentage of your salary. Though the exact formula varies from company to company, and you're not contributing enough to capture that full match, you are in the most literal sense possible declining money your employer is trying to hand you, not a bonus contingent on performance, not a raise you have to negotiate for. Money that exists purely because you asked for it by contributing your own share first. Picture two employees at the same company, same salary, same match formula. One contributes enough to get the full match. The other contributes nothing. Maybe because the paperwork felt confusing when they were hired. Maybe because they meant to set it up and never got around to it. Maybe because 5 years ago money was tight, and they told themselves they'd deal with it later, and later never came. Over a 20 or 30-year career, that gap in outcomes isn't a rounding error. It's often tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes far more once growth is factored in, and it happened entirely because one person automated a decision and the other person left a decision sitting unmade, year after year, without ever consciously choosing to leave it that way. This is why the very first automatic step in this whole philosophy, before percentages, before mortgages, before anything else, is almost always the same. Find out if your employer offers a match, and if they do, contribute at least enough to capture every dollar of it. It is by a wide margin the highest guaranteed return available anywhere in ordinary personal finance, because it's not a return on an investment that might go up or down. It's an instant guaranteed multiplication of money the moment it lands in the account. The fix here mirrors the fix for saving itself. Automate the decision so it never has to be made repeatedly. Many retirement accounts offer something called a target date fund, named for the approximate year you expect to retire, that automatically holds a mix of investments appropriate for someone that many years away from needing the money, and automatically adjusts that mix, growing more conservative on its own as the target date approaches. Choosing one of these funds once at setup accomplishes for your investment choices exactly what an automatic paycheck deduction accomplishes for your saving rate. It removes the requirement to keep making a good decision every single year. It makes the good decision once and lets that decision quietly adjust itself over decades without requiring your ongoing attention. This matters because plenty of otherwise diligent savers have undone a huge portion of their own progress simply by reacting emotionally to their investment choices, panicking and moving everything to cash, during a downturn out of fear and then missing the recovery that followed, or chasing whatever investment happened to be performing best last year right before its turn to underperform arrived. Automating the investment choice itself, the same way you automate the contribution, removes one more place where willpower was quietly being asked to do a job it was never reliable enough to do. Okay, back to the percentage question, because it's the next natural thing anyone asks once they understand the pay-yourself-first idea in principle. How much should you actually be saving? And the answer that gets proposed isn't a fixed dollar amount, because dollar amounts feel arbitrary and easy to dismiss depending on what you earn. It's a percentage. A specific one gets floated as a starting target, somewhere around 10 to 15% of your gross income, automated straight into retirement savings, before taxes even take their cut in the accounts where that's possible. 10 to 15% sounds aggressive if you've never tried it. It sounds like the kind of number that would crush a budget, the kind of number that makes people close the article, close the tab, decide this whole philosophy isn't for them because they can barely make rent as it is. But here's the twist that makes the whole system work psychologically. And it's worth repeating because it's counterintuitive, because it happens automatically before the money ever touches your checking account. Most people adjust their spending to whatever's left without ever consciously feeling the sacrifice. You cannot miss money you never held. This is one of the strange, almost paradoxical truths about human behavior with cash. Losing something you already have hurts, sometimes disproportionately. Never having had it in the first place barely registers at all. There's research on this exact phenomenon, sitting under the broader umbrella of loss aversion, the finding, replicated again and again in behavioral economics, that the pain of losing a given amount of money is psychologically more intense than the pleasure of gaining the same amount. It's why watching money get withdrawn from an account you've already grown used to feels worse than simply never having deposited it there. Automation exploits this quirk of human psychology in your own favor for once, instead of against you, which is usually how it operates in advertising and impulse spending. Now, let's slow down here, because there's a deeper mechanism running underneath all of this, and it's worth naming directly, because once you see it, you'll see it everywhere in your financial life. And honestly, in most of the rest of your life too. Human beings are wired for the present. This isn't a moral failing. It's neurology. It's evolution. It's the simple fact that a reward today has always mattered more to a survival-focused brain than an abstract reward decades from now. Behavioral economists have a term for this: present bias or hyperbolic discounting. If you want the more technical phrase, it means we systematically overvalue immediate gratification and undervalue future benefits, even when we know intellectually that the math doesn't support that preference. There's an old experiment, famous in psychology circles, involving children and a single marshmallow. A researcher places a marshmallow in front of a child and explains that if the child can wait a short while without eating it, they'll get a second marshmallow as a reward. Some children wait. Many don't. And the children who could wait in later follow-up studies tended to show better outcomes across a range of life measures years down the road. The experiment has been debated and refined over the decades since, and the story is more complicated than the simple version that gets repeated at conferences, but the core tension it illustrates is real, and it never really leaves us as adults. We are all of us. That same child staring at the marshmallow, except the marshmallow now looks like a new phone, a nicer car, a dinner out, a subscription box of coffee, and the second marshmallow looks like something abstract called retirement, decades away, impossible to picture clearly, easy to discount. This is why just save more as advice fails so often. It's not a knowledge problem. Almost everyone knows they should save more. It's a structural problem. Every single month, saving requires a fresh act of willpower fighting against a brain that's biologically tilted toward the immediate. And willpower, As any exhausted parent or dieter or person at 11 p.m. scrolling their phone instead of sleeping can tell you, is a depleting resource. You don't have an infinite supply of it. You spend it making decisions all day, and by evening or by the 15th of the month or by the third time this week your favorite restaurant runs a promotion, it's gone. Before we go further, it's worth actually seeing the compounding math that makes all of this worth doing in the first place. Because compound interest gets thrown around so often in personal finance conversations that it started to sound like a vague blessing rather than an actual mechanism you can calculate on the back of a napkin. There's a shortcut called the Rule of 72 that makes this almost embarrassingly simple. Divide 72 by your expected annual rate of return, and the result tells you roughly how many years it takes for a given sum to double. At a reasonable long-term average return, something in the neighborhood of 7 or 8% a year, 72 divided by 8 gives you 9. Your money roughly doubles every 9 years without you adding another single dollar to it. Picture $100 invested once at that same rate and never touched again. In 9 years, it's roughly 200. In 18 years, roughly 400. In 27 years, roughly 800. In 36 years, 1,600. Notice what's happening here. The dollar growth in the final 9-year stretch, from 800 to 1,600, is larger than the entire original sum multiplied several times over, and none of that later growth required a single additional contribution. It's the earlier growth, sitting there quietly generating its own growth, generation after generation of doubling, entirely on its own. This is why the age at which you start automating your saving matters so much more than most people intuitively expect, more than the specific dollar amount you start with. Someone who begins automating a modest contribution at 25 is handing their money 4 or even 5 extra doublings compared to someone who starts the exact same modest contribution at 45. And those extra doublings arriving in the later, larger numbered years of the sequence can dwarf everything contributed in between. This isn't a reason for anyone starting later to despair, and we'll come back to that reassurance directly later on. But it is the single clearest illustration of why I'll start saving seriously once I earn more is such a costly trap. The years lost to waiting are disproportionately the most valuable years in the entire sequence, precisely because they're the ones farthest from today, with the most doublings still ahead of them. Automation is the workaround. It doesn't ask your present-biased brain to make a good decision every single month. It makes the good decision once, at setup, and then removes your brain from the loop entirely. You could have a terrible month, full of impulsive decisions and forgotten resolutions, and your retirement account would still grow, because the system doesn't care what kind of month you're having. It just executes quietly in the background, indifferent to your mood. This is the quiet, almost anticlimactic secret behind ordinary people becoming millionaires without extraordinary incomes. It was never about discipline in the moment. It was about discipline exactly once, the discipline to set up a system, followed by decades of not having to think about it at all. Let's return to the couple in that advisor's office, because their story doesn't end at the coffee math. There's a second, bigger surprise waiting, and it's the part of the story that reframes an entire category of financial advice most people accept without ever questioning it. The advisor asks about their home. Do they own it? They do. Modest place, nothing extravagant. Bought years earlier when they were younger, and had less money and, frankly, less confidence than they have now. And this is where the story challenges another piece of conventional wisdom that a lot of financial commentary loves to repeat. The idea that renting is smarter than owning, that a mortgage is just a trap, that you should wait until you can really afford a house before buying one. The story pushes back hard on that. Home ownership in this framing isn't primarily about lifestyle or pride or having a yard. It's about forced savings on a scale most people can't replicate any other way. Every month, a mortgage payment includes a piece that goes toward principal, meaning it's not an expense at all in the traditional sense. It's you transferring money from your checking account into an asset you own, whether you feel like doing it that month or not. It's automated equity building, baked into a bill you were going to have to pay anyway, just to have a roof over your head. Whether that roof was one you owned or one you were paying someone else's mortgage down for instead. Picture two people, same age, same income, same city. One rents an apartment for $1,500 a month. The other buys a modest starter home with a mortgage payment of roughly the same amount once taxes and insurance are folded in. Fast forward 20 years. The renter has paid, conservatively, somewhere around $360,000 in rent over those 2 decades, assuming rent even stayed flat the whole time, which it almost never does. At the end of it, they own nothing. Not a single dollar of that rent converted into anything they can sell, borrow against, or pass on. The owner, meanwhile, has paid a similar amount toward their mortgage, but a meaningful chunk of every payment went toward principal building equity month after month, and on top of that, the home itself likely appreciated in value over those same 20 years. The owner walks away from that same 2 decades with an asset potentially worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The renter walks away with 2 decades of receipts. Renters, the story points out, often end up paying more per month for the exact same physical space than owners with a mortgage, and receive nothing back for it beyond the space itself. Owners, meanwhile, are quietly building equity every single month, an asset that over enough years tends to appreciate. It isn't guaranteed. Nothing in this world is guaranteed. Markets rise and fall, and there are absolutely years where home values dip, sometimes sharply, sometimes painfully. But zoom out to the decades-long view this story insists on, and homeownership becomes one of the most powerful automatic wealth-building tools available to ordinary earners, precisely because it doesn't require them to be good at investing. It just requires them to keep living somewhere and keep paying the bill they were going to pay, regardless of whether their name was on the deed. There's an obstacle that comes up almost immediately whenever this idea gets discussed, and it deserves a direct answer rather than a dismissive wave: the down payment. For a lot of people, especially younger earners just starting out, the idea of saving up tens of thousands of dollars before they can even begin building equity feels like exactly the kind of impossible distant number that killed their motivation to save in the first place. The same emotional trap as the retirement number that felt too big to bother with. Here's where the automatic principle applies just as cleanly to a down payment as it does to retirement. Rather than treating the down payment as a single enormous target that has to be hit before anything can happen, the same automatic transfer used for retirement contributions can simply be split, routing a portion into a dedicated separate down payment fund every single paycheck, automatically invisibly the same way retirement contributions disappear before they're ever felt as spendable. A modest, automated transfer of even a few $100s a month left untouched for several years accumulates into a meaningful down payment without ever requiring the saver to feel like they were white-knuckling their way through years of deprivation to get there. The number that felt impossible as a lump sum becomes almost unremarkable once it's broken into small, automatic monthly pieces running quietly in the background while the rest of life continues completely normally. There's a version of this story worth telling too. About a young couple who spent their first few years of working life renting, feeling like homeownership was permanently out of reach, watching friends who'd received family help with a down payment move into homes years earlier than they expected to, rather than giving up on the idea entirely. They simply automated a modest transfer invisible enough that it never felt like sacrifice and treated the growing down payment fund the same way they treated a retirement account, something that existed quietly in the background, occasionally checked, never agonized over. 5 years later, without any dramatic windfall, without any lucky break, the fund had quietly grown into something substantial enough to make an offer on a modest starter home. Nothing about those 5 years felt remarkable while they were happening. The remarkable part only became visible in hindsight, once the number in the account finally caught up to the goal that had once felt impossible. There's a specific trick nested inside this part of the story too, one that sounds almost too simple to matter, and yet the math on it is startling. It involves changing how often you make mortgage payments. Most mortgages are structured for 12 monthly payments a year. But what if, instead, you paid half your monthly payment every 2 weeks? At first glance, that sounds identical. Half a payment, twice a month, same as one full payment a month, right? Except there are 52 weeks in a year, not 48. Divide that into 2-week increments, and you get 26 half payments, not 24. Which means, without ever feeling like you increased your budget, you've slipped in one extra full payment per year. One extra payment a year, applied directly against the principal of a mortgage, can shave years off a 30-year loan, not months, years. Sometimes 5, sometimes closer to 10, depending on the interest rate and the size of the loan. Picture a mortgage of roughly $200,000 at a moderate interest rate on a standard 30-year schedule. Switching to bi-weekly payments on that loan can often shorten it to somewhere around 22 or 23 years instead of 30, and the total interest saved over the life of that mortgage can run into the tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes considerably more, depending on the specifics. All from a scheduling trick. No extra income required. No lifestyle sacrifice. Just automating the timing of payments you were already making and letting the calendar quietly do the rest of the work. Picture a slightly larger mortgage to see how the same trick scales, since the size of the benefit grows right alongside the size of the loan. A $400,000 mortgage at a similar moderate rate on the same standard 30-year schedule might shed a comparable number of years under a bi-weekly structure, but because the loan itself is twice as large, the total interest saved over the life of the loan can end up being close to twice as large as well, often landing somewhere in the range of tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes considerably more depending on the exact rate and starting balance. The mechanism doesn't change with the size of the loan, only the dollar value of the benefit does, and it scales in the saver's favor as the mortgage itself grows larger. There's a practical detail worth naming honestly here, because a shortcut this good tends to attract a version of itself that isn't actually free. Some mortgage services offer an official bi-weekly payment program, sometimes for a setup fee or an ongoing small charge, marketed as a convenient way to access exactly this benefit. It's worth knowing that the underlying trick can almost always be replicated without paying anyone anything extra at all, simply by manually setting up one additional principal-only payment per year, or by directing a slightly larger monthly payment that mathematically accomplishes the same extra payment effect through whatever free payment portal the actual mortgage lender already provides. The value here comes entirely from the extra payment itself, not from any special program required to make that extra payment happen. And it's worth confirming with your specific lender that any extra payments made this way are applied directly to principal, rather than simply held and applied toward the next scheduled payment, which would quietly cancel out the entire benefit without ever announcing that it had done so. This is the pattern, again and again, throughout the story. Small structural shifts, set up once, compounding silently in the background, doing more heavy lifting than any amount of white-knuckle budgeting ever could. Now here's where the story does something that a lot of personal finance advice skips entirely, and it's worth sitting with, because it's the emotional core of the whole thing. The couple, remember, started this meeting angry, skeptical, almost offended by the suggestion that they were secretly wealthy, because it didn't match how they felt about their own financial lives. They didn't feel rich. They felt like they were scraping by some months, comfortable other months, entirely normal in the way most working people feel entirely normal. The revelation that their home equity, their retirement contributions, their slow and unglamorous accumulation over years had quietly assembled into 7 figures. That hits differently than a lecture about budgeting ever could. It's not motivational, it's evidentiary. It's proof, sitting right there in black and white, that the system had been working the whole time, even while they weren't paying attention to it. Even during the months they felt broke. Watch what actually happens in that room. In the quiet seconds after the number gets said out loud, there's no immediate celebration. There's a kind of stunned recalculation, the wife running back through years of memory, trying to reconcile a felt sense of financial ordinariness with a number that suggests something closer to extraordinary success, and finding the more she thinks about it that both things were simultaneously true the entire time. They really did feel ordinary, month to month worrying about the same small things everyone worries about. And they really had, without any single dramatic moment they could point to, built something remarkable, entirely out of small, repeated, boring decisions made years and years ago and never revisited since. And this is maybe the most important reframe the whole story offers. You do not have to feel wealthy while building wealth. In fact, if the system is working correctly, you might barely notice it at all month to month. Wealth built automatically tends to be invisible in the moment and undeniable in the aggregate. It's not a story about sudden windfalls. It's a story about the strange, almost boring power of patient, unwitnessed accumulation. There's a reason this particular reframe lands so hard for so many people hearing this story for the first time, and it's worth naming directly. Most cultural narratives about wealth are built around visible, dramatic moments. A big sale, a lucky break, a startup that takes off, an inheritance, a lottery ticket, a viral moment that changes everything overnight. Those stories are exciting to tell and exciting to hear, and they're also, for the overwhelming majority of people who will ever become financially comfortable, almost entirely irrelevant to how it actually happens. The real, statistically dominant path to financial comfort for ordinary earners has never looked like any of those dramatic stories. It's looked like this couple sitting in an advisor's office, stunned by a number that had been quietly accumulating the entire time, built by nothing more dramatic than a handful of automatic transfers set up years earlier and simply left alone. There's a second couple who show up later in the story, and their contrast serves as a kind of warning wrapped in the same warm, non-judgmental tone the whole narrative uses throughout. This couple earns significantly more than the first couple. Professionals, well into 6 figures each, living what looks from the outside like a fully successful life, the kind of life a lot of people would look at with envy. And they have almost nothing saved, not because they're reckless or foolish, because their spending expanded exactly as fast as their income did. Bigger house because they could afford it. Nicer cars because why not? They'd earned it. More frequent vacations, better restaurants, private school considerations, a lifestyle that consumed every dollar they brought in and then some, financed partly on credit that quietly compounded against them the same way their income should have been compounding for them. This is a phenomenon that gets a name in behavioral economic circles, lifestyle inflation, sometimes called the hedonic treadmill, the idea that our sense of enough recalibrates upward every time our income rises, so that no matter how much we earn, we always feel like we need just a little more to be comfortable. There's a deeper mechanism worth naming underneath this couple's story, because it explains why lifestyle inflation feels so natural, so invisible, so much like simple common sense rather than a trap. Human beings judge their own financial situation less by some fixed objective standard and far more by comparison to the people around them, neighbors, co-workers, old classmates now visible through social media siblings, friends from a similar starting point in life who've pulled ahead or fallen behind. This is sometimes called social comparison, and it means that a household earning what would have seemed like an extraordinary income a generation ago can nonetheless feel constantly behind, constantly stretched, constantly slightly short of comfortable, purely because the reference point keeps moving along with everyone else's spending. Social media has made this comparison mechanism considerably more aggressive than it used to be. A generation ago, the visible reference points in most people's lives were a fairly narrow circle: actual neighbors, actual coworkers, people whose full financial reality, including their debts and their stress, was reasonably knowable over time. Today, the visible reference points include a nearly endless stream of curated, filtered glimpses into other people's vacations, renovations, purchases, and celebrations, almost none of it accompanied by any visible information about the debt financing it, the anxiety underneath it, or the sustainability of it over the following decade. The comparison set has grown enormously wider and, at the exact same time, has become enormously less honest, which is close to the worst possible combination for anyone trying to feel content with an already perfectly reasonable financial life. The second couple in this story isn't described as unusually vain or unusually reckless. They're described as ordinary people responding to an ordinary, deeply human pressure in a completely predictable way, without ever having built the one structural defense that would have protected them regardless of how strong that pressure became. An automated system that removed a fixed percentage before their lifestyle ever had the chance to see it compare itself to anyone else's, and decide it needed to keep pace. The lesson embedded in this second couple's story isn't subtle, but it needed to be told this bluntly, because so many people assume income is the whole game. Earn more, and your problems solve themselves, right? Except income without automated savings is just a bigger number passing through your hands on its way to being spent. It's not what you earn that builds wealth. It's the automated percentage of it you never let yourself touch. This is why the 10 to 15% figure gets described as a percentage rather than a fixed amount in the first place, because it scales. As your income grows, the automated amount grows right along with it, without requiring you to renegotiate your own discipline every time you get a raise. The system captures the raise before your lifestyle has a chance to notice it arrived at all. There's a small addition worth naming here, because a lot of people ask about it once they hear the percentage idea. What about raises specifically? One version of this approach suggests something almost sly. Automate an increase in your savings percentage every time your income goes up, even by a single percentage point, so that a portion of every raise you ever receive goes straight into savings before your checking account balance even reflects the new larger paycheck. Because you never experienced the higher number as spendable in the first place, you never miss the portion that got diverted. Your lifestyle rises more slowly than your income does, and the gap between the two, compounded across an entire career, is where a very large portion of automatic wealth actually gets built. Let's talk about debt for a moment, because the story doesn't ignore it, and it doesn't pretend that automation alone magically erases what you already owe. The advice here follows a similar logic to the mortgage trick. Automate extra payments toward debt, even small ones, the same way you'd automate savings, because debt with interest is, in a sense, the mirror image of investing with compound interest. If your investments compound in your favor over time, high-interest debt compounds against you, just as relentlessly, just as invisibly month over month, until a balance that once looked manageable has ballooned in a way that feels almost impossible to explain, unless you understand the math of compounding, in which case it makes perfect and depressing sense. There are two common approaches people use for tackling multiple debts, and it's worth naming both, because the choice between them says something interesting about human psychology. Before getting into those two approaches, it's worth actually seeing the math of why credit card debt specifically deserves such urgent attention, because the numbers involved surprise a lot of people the first time they sit down and calculate them properly rather than just glancing at a minimum payment on a statement. Picture a balance of $5,000 sitting on a credit card with an interest rate in the high teens, which is fairly ordinary for this kind of debt. If only the minimum payment is made each month, a figure often calculated as a small percentage of the remaining balance, The majority of that payment in the early months goes almost entirely toward interest rather than the actual balance itself. Paying only the minimum on a balance like that can stretch repayment out well over a decade, and the total interest paid over that stretch can end up exceeding the original amount borrowed, meaning the $5,000 originally spent effectively becomes $10,000 or more by the time it's fully repaid purely through the compounding of interest against a balance that barely shrinks each month. Compare that to automating a fixed extra payment on top of the minimum, even a relatively modest one, and the difference in both total interest paid and total time to repayment is dramatic, often cutting years off. The repayment timeline and saving thousands of dollars in interest that would otherwise have been paid for absolutely nothing in return. This is the mirror image of the compound interest that makes automated retirement savings so powerful. In the retirement case, compounding works in your favor, growing money you've set aside. In the credit card case, compounding works against you, growing a debt you've already spent. And the automated extra payment is simply the debt side equivalent of the automated retirement contribution, a fixed, non-negotiable action that neutralizes the compounding before it has the chance to run wild. One approach, often called the avalanche method, says to attack the debt with the highest interest rate first, since that's mathematically optimal and saves the most money overall. The other, often called the snowball method, says to attack the smallest balance first, regardless of interest rate. Because paying off an entire debt, even a small one, produces a psychological win, a visible piece of proof that the system is working, and that emotional momentum often matters more for follow-through than the extra few dollars saved by being mathematically perfect. Neither approach works if it isn't automated. The specific method matters less than the fact that whichever one you choose, it happens without requiring a fresh decision every single month. The suggested strategy, regardless of which method appeals to you, is to automate a fixed extra payment toward the targeted debt every month, treating it exactly like a bill you can't skip, exactly like the retirement contribution, exactly like the extra mortgage payment. Not pay off debt when there's extra money, because there is never extra money. There's only money you've decided in advance to allocate somewhere specific. The moment debt repayment becomes automatic and non-negotiable, it stops depending on your mood, your motivation, or how tired you are that particular month. There's a phrase that shows up here, something to the effect of, "The system doesn't need you to be motivated. It needs you to be automated." Motivation is unreliable. It shows up strong on January 1st and evaporates by February. Automation doesn't care what mood you're in. It executes regardless, every single time, without needing to be convinced. There's also a quieter piece of this puzzle that often gets overlooked entirely in the excitement around retirement accounts and mortgages: the emergency fund. Because here's the uncomfortable truth about automated saving systems: they can be derailed instantly by a single unexpected expense if there's no buffer in place. A car repair, a medical bill, an appliance that dies at the worst possible moment. Without a cushion, that unexpected cost often gets put on a credit card, and suddenly the very debt you were automating payments against starts growing again, undoing months of progress in a single unlucky week. The fix, predictably, is the same principle applied one more time. Automate a small, separate transfer into a dedicated savings account every month, even a modest one, until it reaches a few months' worth of essential expenses. Once it hits that target, the automatic transfer can redirect itself towards something else: more retirement contributions, more debt repayment, whatever comes next in the priority order. The emergency fund isn't meant to be exciting. It's meant to be boring, sitting quietly in the background, existing purely so that a bad week doesn't become a bad decade. A common target for that cushion is somewhere between 3 and 6 months' worth of essential expenses: rent or mortgage, groceries, utilities, insurance, minimum debt payments, with the exact number depending on how stable a person's income actually is. Someone with a highly stable job, a dual-income household and strong job security might reasonably lean toward the smaller end of that range. Someone with irregular income, a single-income household, or a less stable industry might reasonably want the larger end or even somewhat beyond it, simply because the cost of running out of cushion during an income gap is so much higher for them than for someone with more stability to fall back on. There's a story worth telling here about what this cushion actually buys someone beyond the obvious math of avoided credit card interest. Picture someone who's automated a solid retirement contribution, automated extra debt payments, done everything right by the letter of the philosophy, but skipped the emergency fund step because it felt like the least exciting, least rewarding piece of the whole system. The one part that doesn't visibly grow into an exciting number over time the way a retirement account does. Then a car engine fails unexpectedly, an essential repair with no flexibility about timing, costing a meaningful chunk of a month's income all at once, without a cushion. That repair goes on a credit card at whatever interest rate that card happens to carry. And suddenly this person is paying down new high-interest debt at the exact same time they were automating extra payments against old debt, undoing a real portion of the progress they'd already made, purely because a single unlucky week caught them without a buffer. With a cushion in place, the exact same car repair is simply paid for in full immediately without touching a credit card at all, without generating a single dollar of new interest. And the automatic retirement and debt repayment transfers continue running completely undisturbed exactly as planned because the emergency fund did precisely the job it was built for. The difference between these two versions of the same unlucky week isn't about income or willpower. It's entirely about whether one quiet, boring, unglamorous piece of the system had been set up in advance. Now here's a twist worth pausing on, something that tends to surprise people who assume this whole philosophy is about grim, joyless frugality. The story insists quite deliberately that automation should include giving, not just saving and debt repayment, a portion automated going toward charity or causes the person cares about. And the reasoning offered isn't purely moral, though there's a moral dimension to it, it's psychological. People who give even modest amounts automatically and consistently tend to report a different relationship with their money entirely. Less anxious, less scarcity-driven, more oriented around abundance rather than restriction. Automating generosity removes the guilt versus selfishness tug-of-war that so many people feel around money, the sense that saving is selfish or that spending on others means sacrificing your own future. When it's all automated in its own separate lane, the accounts don't compete with each other in your head anymore. Each dollar already has a job before it even lands in your account. Nothing is up for a fresh moral debate every month. There's a small story worth telling here about a single person early in their career, earning a modest salary, who set up an automatic monthly donation to a cause they cared about, a relatively small amount, small enough that it barely registered against their overall budget. For the first several months, it felt like a slightly uncomfortable stretch, a reminder every time they glanced at their account that they'd committed a piece of an already tight budget to something other than their own immediate needs. Within about a year, something shifted, and it wasn't really about the money at all. The discomfort faded, replaced by something closer to quiet pride, a sense that their financial life included room for something beyond their own consumption, and that this room had been carved out deliberately rather than left to chance the way give when there's extra almost always ends up meaning giving nothing at all. Years later, as that same person's income grew, the automated giving amount grew right alongside it, the same way the automated retirement percentage did, without ever requiring a fresh, uncomfortable decision each time a raise arrived. What started as a small, almost symbolic gesture early in a career had become, by the time retirement came into view, a genuinely meaningful cumulative contribution, made possible entirely because the very first automatic transfer had been set up once, years earlier, and simply left running. Let's zoom out for a second, because there's a structural elegance to this whole approach that's worth naming directly, almost like an architecture diagram for money. Paycheck arrives. Before it hits checking, the employer match gets captured in full, because leaving free money on the table isn't frugality, it's just a loss. Before it hits checking, retirement savings peel off automatically, some percentage growing as income grows and rising a little further every time a raise arrives. Before it hits checking, an emergency fund contribution peels off until the cushion is built and the transfer redirects elsewhere. Before it hits checking, extra debt repayment peels off automatically, targeted at whichever balance the person chose to prioritize. Before it hits checking, a slice for giving peels off automatically. Mortgage payments are restructured onto a bi-weekly schedule, so an extra payment slips in every year without anyone noticing. And whatever's left after all of that lands in checking, and that's the number the person actually lives on month to month, guilt-free, because everything that matters has already been handled before they even see the total. No budget in the traditional sense, no line item tracking of every restaurant meal or every stray purchase. No moral surveillance of your own spending habits. The story argues somewhat controversially compared to more traditional finance advice that detailed budgeting is exactly the kind of high-friction, high-willpower system that fails most people within a few months. The same way most diets fail, the same way most New Year's resolutions fail. Automation succeeds precisely because it removes the requirement for ongoing willpower altogether. Set it up once, let it run. Check in occasionally, sure. Adjust as life changes. But the day-to-day battle against your own impulses simply isn't part of the design. There's an idea that surfaces here worth sitting with. Something almost philosophical buried inside what looks like a practical finance book. The gap between people who intend to save and people who actually save is enormous, and it has almost nothing to do with how much they earn or how much they know about investing. Ask almost anyone if they intend to save more this year, and the answer is yes. Overwhelmingly yes. Ask how many actually increase their savings rate, and the number collapses. This is sometimes called the intention-action gap, and it shows up everywhere in human behavior, not just money. The gap between the diet you intend to start and the one you actually follow. The gap between the exercise routine you plan and the one you maintain. The gap between the novel you intend to write and the one sitting half-finished in a drawer somewhere. The gap between the gym membership you signed up for in January with genuine enthusiasm and the one gathering dust by March. It's worth sitting with why this gap is so wide and so consistent across nearly every domain of self-improvement, because understanding the mechanism makes the solution feel less like a moral failing and more like an engineering problem. Intentions are formed in calm, reflective moments, sitting quietly, thinking about the future, feeling motivated and clear-headed. Actions, on the other hand, have to survive being executed in the actual moment, often a tired, distracted, tempted moment, entirely different in character from the calm moment the intention was originally formed in. A gym membership signed up for in a moment of New Year's optimism has to survive being acted on repeatedly at 6 in the morning on a cold, tired Tuesday months later, when the original optimism has long since faded and been replaced by an entirely different, far less motivated version of the same person. This is precisely why relying on willpower to bridge that gap fails so reliably across so many different areas of life for so many otherwise capable and intelligent people. Willpower asks the tired, distracted, tempted version of you in the actual moment of action to somehow access the clarity and motivation of the calm, reflective version of you who formed the original intention. Those two versions of a person are in a very real psychological sense not the same person at all, and expecting the tired evening version to consistently honor a promise made by the clear-headed morning version is expecting something that fails on average far more often than it succeeds for nearly everyone regardless of character or discipline. Automation solves this by removing the tired, distracted, tempted version of you from the equation entirely. The clear-headed version, the one who formed the intention in a calm moment, gets to make the decision exactly once, at setup, and then the system executes that decision automatically, forever, without ever needing to ask the tired evening version of you for permission again. Automation is, in a very real sense, a tool for closing that gap without requiring you to become a fundamentally different, more disciplined person. You don't have to win the daily battle against your own present bias. You just have to win it once, at the moment you set up the automatic transfers, and then the system carries your past intentions forward into your future action, whether your future self feels motivated or not. There's a common objection worth addressing directly here, because it comes up almost every time this philosophy gets explained to someone whose income doesn't look like a steady, predictable paycheck. What about people who are self-employed, or who freelance, or whose income swings dramatically from month to month depending on which clients paid on time and which projects landed? A fixed dollar amount automatically withdrawn every month regardless of circumstances sounds like exactly the kind of rigid system that could backfire badly during a lean month, forcing an overdraft or a missed bill in the name of discipline. The fix here is a small but important adjustment to the automation itself. Automate a percentage rather than a fixed dollar amount, applied at the moment income actually arrives rather than on a fixed calendar schedule. Someone with irregular income can set up a rule, as automatic and non-negotiable as any fixed monthly transfer, that a certain percentage of every single payment that lands in their account, every invoice paid, every project completed, gets immediately split off into savings, debt repayment, and giving, in whatever proportions make sense for their situation before the rest becomes spendable. A slow month naturally produces a smaller automatic transfer. A strong month naturally produces a larger one. The percentage itself never wavers, which means the discipline never actually depends on remembering to apply it consistently. It's baked directly into the structure of every incoming payment, the moment that payment lands, rather than depending on a calm, retrospective decision made after the money has already had a chance to feel like spendable cash sitting in a checking account. This adjustment matters enormously for a specific kind of person who might otherwise assume this entire philosophy simply doesn't apply to them, because so much of the language around automatic transfers implicitly assumes a steady paycheck arriving on a predictable schedule. The underlying principle, though, was never really about paychecks specifically. It was about removing the decision point wherever that decision point happens to occur, and irregular earners can build exactly that same removed decision point structure around their own less predictable cash flow, simply by anchoring the automation to each incoming payment rather than to a fixed date on the calendar. There's a third story worth telling here because it addresses the fear that quietly sits underneath a lot of this for anyone listening who feels like they've already fallen behind. What about someone who starts late? Picture someone in their late 30s, maybe early 40s, who spent their 20s and much of their 30s with no real saving strategy at all. Not reckless necessarily, just unfocused, the way a lot of people are before something clicks. They look at the math of compound growth and feel a wave of something close to despair, because so much of the advice about starting early assumes decades of runway that they no longer have. Here's the reframe the story offers, and it's a genuinely useful one. The system doesn't require decades to start working. It requires starting. Someone who begins automating even a modest percentage of their income at 40 still has 25 or more years of compounding ahead of them before a typical retirement age, and 25 years of consistent automated contributions, even started later than ideal, produces a dramatically different outcome than another 25 years of no strategy at all. The version of this story that gets remembered is the couple in their 20s who automated everything and retired comfortable and unremarkable. But the quieter, less discussed version is just as important, the person who starts at 40, because today is the earliest day left to start, and 20 years later looks at a balance that would have seemed impossible if they'd let the head start. They didn't have talked them out of trying at all. Picture this concretely for a moment, because the specific numbers help make the reassurance feel real rather than merely comforting. Someone who starts automating a meaningful percentage of a modest income at 25 and never increases that percentage beyond keeping pace with raises can reasonably expect by traditional retirement age to have built a portfolio worth well over $1 million purely through decades of consistent contribution and compounding without ever needing an unusually high income or an unusually clever investment strategy. Someone who starts the exact same percentage at 40, losing those crucial early doublings discussed earlier, will end up with a meaningfully smaller number by the same retirement age simply because they had fewer years for the compounding to work. But meaningfully smaller than the 25-year-old's outcome and meaningfully smaller than doing nothing at all are two entirely different comparisons. And the second one is the comparison that actually matters for someone standing at 40, deciding whether to start today or keep waiting for some better, more motivated future moment, that if the pattern of the last 15 years is any indication may never actually arrive on its own. There's a version of this story worth telling about someone who spent their 30s in a genuine state of financial denial, avoiding retirement account statements entirely, avoiding conversations about money with friends who seemed to have their finances more together, carrying a quiet, private shame about how far behind they felt. The turning point wasn't a windfall or a sudden burst of willpower. It was a single afternoon spent setting up one automatic transfer, uncomfortable and anxiety-inducing in the moment, followed immediately by nothing at all. No daily battle, no ongoing discipline required, just the transfer running quietly every month from that point forward, 15 years later. The number sitting in that account entirely a product of that one afternoon's decision, and nothing more dramatic than that was large enough to fundamentally change how this person thought about their own future, not because they'd become a different, more disciplined person somewhere along the way, but because the system they'd built didn't require them to be the single most important piece of advice in the entire story. When you strip away every specific number and every specific account type might be this one. The system needs to be set up once, and once is genuinely all it takes. Not a lifetime of willpower, not a personality transplant into someone naturally disciplined. 1 hour sitting down, adjusting a contribution percentage on a retirement account, setting up an automatic transfer into a separate savings account, switching a mortgage to a bi-weekly schedule, automating a small recurring donation. 1 hour. And then decades of not having to think about it again, except to occasionally check in and adjust as life changes. A raise, a new job, a paid-off debt, freeing up room for something else. There's something almost generational buried in this idea too, worth a brief mention before we come back to where we started. Kids raised watching this kind of automation happen in their own household, watching a parent explain even briefly that a piece of every paycheck goes somewhere before it's ever considered spendable, tend to absorb that structure as normal rather than as some special discipline reserved for finance experts. It becomes the default they carry into their own first jobs, their own first paychecks, rather than a system they have to discover and adopt later, the way their parents likely did. Automatic habits, it turns out, are almost as inheritable as they are personal. There's a specific, small ritual worth naming here, one that costs almost nothing and takes almost no time, but seems to matter more than its size would suggest. Some parents make a point of sitting down with a teenager at their very first paycheck, not to lecture about budgeting in the abstract, but to actually open the specific account together and set up one small automatic transfer on the spot into a savings account before that first paycheck is ever spent on anything at all. The amount barely matters. What matters is the sequence, earning money and immediately automating a piece of it, before spending habits have had the chance to form around the assumption that the entire paycheck is available for anything the teenager wants. A habit installed at the very first paycheck, before any competing habit has had time to take root, tends to feel like the default for the rest of that person's working life, The same way a native language, learned before any other, tends to feel effortless in a way a second language learned later almost never quite manages to. Contrast that with the more common pattern where a young adult spends several years treating their entire paycheck as spendable forms, spending habits around that assumption, and only later, sometimes considerably later, tries to retrofit an automatic savings habit onto a lifestyle that's already expanded to consume the full paycheck. This isn't impossible, and plenty of people do exactly this successfully at 30, at 40, at whatever age they finally encounter this philosophy for the first time. But it requires actively shrinking an already established lifestyle to make room for the automatic transfer, which asks for a small, temporary, uncomfortable adjustment that the teenager who starts on day one never has to make at all, because there was never a bigger lifestyle established first for the automation to have to shrink. Let's come back one more time to that image from the beginning. The couple staring at a net worth statement they didn't believe because it didn't match how their month-to-month life had felt. That gap between felt experience and actual accumulation is, in some ways, the entire emotional payload of this story. Wealth built this way doesn't announce itself. There's no single dramatic moment where you look at your bank account and gasp. It's compound interest, silent and patient, working in the background of an otherwise completely normal life, normal jobs, normal mortgages, normal occasional splurges on coffee or dinner out, normal ordinary months that didn't feel special in any way. And then, one day, years later, someone runs the numbers, and the numbers say something the felt experience never predicted. This is, in the end, maybe the most reassuring idea buried in the whole story. And it's worth saying plainly, you do not need to be extraordinary to end up wealthy. You do not need a high income, a lucky break, a genius investment pick, or an iron will that never wavers. You need a system that doesn't depend on any of those things, one that runs automatically, quietly, in the background of a completely ordinary life, doing on your behalf what your own willpower was never reliably going to do for you. If any of this is landing the way it's meant to, the coffee math, the mortgage trick, the quiet math of a life that looked ordinary and turned out to be worth 7 figures, there's more of exactly this kind of thing waiting for you. Full-length narrations, entire books on money and behavior, distilled into stories you can listen to while you're doing literally anything else, driving, cooking, falling asleep. Search Money Files audiobooks and let the next one play in the background the same way this system builds wealth in the background, quietly, automatically, without you having to think about it too hard, because that's really the last thing worth sitting with before this ends. The people who become wealthy this way rarely feel like they did anything heroic. They just made one decision a long time ago to stop trusting their future selves to remember to save, and started trusting a system instead. And then they got to live their actual lives, messy, ordinary, full of coffee and mortgages, and the occasional splurge while somewhere in the background, without any further effort on their part, the machine they built kept running quietly, faithfully, one automatic transfer at a time until one day the numbers simply said what had been true all along.